The chamber was not designed for silence. Draeven Kelth had sat in it for 120 years and had never once heard it go quiet the way it did when the human pressed her button. But that comes later. First, there was the morning. The session packet arrived on Kelth's display at the 6th hour, as it always did, and he read through it on the transit pod with the same half-attention he had given session packets for decades. Boundary disputes, a navigational hazard designation near the outer corridor, a trade tariff renegotiation between the Thesari and the Growlak that had been renegotiated every 40 years for the last 4 centuries and would presumably be renegotiated again in another 40. And there, 7th on the agenda, tucked between the tariff matter and a routine survey approval, Resolution 1187. Rethani Species Assessment. Theta 7. Recommendation, Preemptive Neutralization. Kelth's crest sat at its customary half-mast as he marked his voting intention. Yes. He moved on to item 8. He had cast that particular vote in one form or another 12 times. He knew the format of a pruning resolution the way he knew the layout of his chambers. Without needing to look at it, the Bureau would present its assessment. The holographic display would show the target world in blue-white relief, the population curve, the technological trajectory arcing upward like an accusation. There would be numbers. There were always numbers. Then the vote, then the containment fleet, then the council would move on to item 8. The transit pod delivered him to the chamber's north entrance with 4 minutes to spare. He took his seat in the Velanori delegation's arc, nodded to his junior colleague, Aethris, and arranged his display. His 6 fingers settled into their resting position on the armrest, drumming the familiar pre-session rhythm, a habit so old he no longer noticed it. The chamber filled around him. 300 species, give or take the occasional empty seat from a delegation in transit or diplomatic dispute. The Growlak block arrived in their characteristic cluster, angular and purposeful. Councilor Thresh at their head, with the look he always wore before a vote he considered obvious. The Thesari settled into their curve of seats with quiet efficiency. The human delegation took their position in the outer ring, which was where new species inevitably sat until they accumulated enough seniority to move inward. Humanity had been a council member for 31 years. They were still in the outer ring. They would be for another century or so at the current rate. Kelth did not specifically register Ambassador Lena Okafor taking her seat. He was reviewing the trade tariff details. The presiding officer called the session to order. Items 1 through 6 passed with the gentle, practiced rhythm of institutional life. Kelth voted on the boundary dispute, noting that the Cathari had secured the favorable boundary again as they usually did. He abstained on the navigational hazard designation, which was technically within the Velanori sphere and required a separate consultation. The Thesari Growlak tariff renegotiation passed, as it always did, and would presumably be renegotiated again in 2381. Then the presiding officer announced Item 7. Bureau Director Scythian took the platform. She was a Cathari of the lean, precise variety, all economy of movement, all data. Kelth had seen her present perhaps 20 times and had always found her efficient. She pulled up the holographic display, Theta 7, a blue-green world third from its star. Unremarkable except for the thin haze of early industrial atmosphere visible at the terminator. The Rethani, reptilian, bipedal, population 3.2 billion, early industrial stage. The technological trajectory curved upward from the grass left corner, projecting forward 400 years to the point where spaceflight became statistically probable. The model's output was displayed in the clean red numerics that Kelth recognized from every pruning assessment. Projected threat probability at spaceflight threshold, 67%. Recommendation, preemptive neutralization, technological suppression to pre-industrial level, monitoring array installation, reassessment in 1,000 years. Standard. 12 minutes. Scythian sat down. Kelth's fingers were midway through their pre-vote sequence when something in his peripheral vision changed. A soft amber glow. The indicator light of a delegation requesting speaking time. The outer ring. The human delegation. He paused. His fingers completed their sequence automatically. His crest rose, perhaps 2 centimeters. Not much, but involuntary. The small physical confession of surprise. Delegates requested speaking time before agenda items occasionally. They rarely requested it before pruning votes. Pruning votes didn't require debate. The Bureau's recommendations had never been overwritten in the model's 300-year history. Kelth could not, at that moment, recall the last time speaking time had even been requested for a pruning item. The presiding officer acknowledged the request. The chair recognizes the human delegation. Ambassador Lena Okafor stood. She was a compact woman, mid-career by human standards, with close-cropped dark hair and an expression that Kelth had seen on perhaps a dozen beings in his 280 years. The expression of someone who has already done the work and is here to show you. She did not move to the platform. She stood at her delegation's position, which was technically irregular and somehow, Kelth thought, exactly the right choice. She held no prepared document. She appeared to need none. She said 3 words: Humanity vetoes Resolution 1187. The chamber stopped, not metaphorically. It actually stopped. The ambient murmur of 300 delegations, the soft percussion of display interactions, the faint ventilation hum that Kelth had stopped noticing approximately 90 years ago, all of it simply ceased to register. Because the human had said something that did not fit in any of the cognitive categories his brain maintained for council proceedings. Veto. His fingers went still. His crest lifted. Not the 2-centimeter flicker of mild surprise, but a genuine rise, pulling upward against the set of his neck muscles, reaching a height it had not achieved during a council session in years. His golden eyes moved to Okafor's face without his entirely choosing to move them. The presiding officer asked her to confirm. She confirmed. For a moment, the chamber held the particular silence of a room full of beings simultaneously retrieving a memory they had never personally needed. A veto. The procedural archives would have the details. The last one had been 200 years ago. The Asari, protesting a boundary settlement, they had been diplomatically quarantined for a generation. Not officially, not by resolution, but in the practiced, invisible way that councils quarantined species who reminded them that the rules permitted things the culture preferred to pretend they did not. The Asari representative, Kesizori, had served out the remainder of her tenure on the back bench. Kelth had heard the story, as all long-serving councilors had. He had always thought Kesizori had been, if not wrong, then certainly impractical. Then Councilor Thresh was on his feet, and the chamber erupted. 6 languages at once, and the translation matrices struggling to keep up. Thresh's voice carried above most of it, deep, flat, the Growlak's characteristic absence of frequency variation that somehow still communicated fury with perfect clarity. He was demanding the override procedure. He was characterizing the veto as a unilateral act of diplomatic aggression. He was citing 3 separate procedural codes. His coalition of security bloc delegates had risen with him, a ripple of standing figures spreading through the chamber's inner tiers. And through all of it, Okafor stood still. Kelth watched her. She was not performing stillness. It was simply her natural state in the presence of noise. A woman who had, somewhere in her training, learned that noise directed at you only has power if you help it find a target. She waited. She seemed entirely prepared to wait longer as required. It took the presiding officer 4 attempts to restore order. Protocol required when a veto was entered that the vetoing delegation present formal reasoning before the chamber could proceed to the override vote. The presiding officer invited Okafor to present. She said, "I'll need 30 minutes." The collective groan was audible through the translation matrix. Pruning debates, on the rare occasions they happened at all, ran perhaps 15 minutes. A full 30-minute presentation was the length of a trade treaty ratification. Thresh made a short, cutting remark that the translation rendered as something between theatrical waste and deliberate obstruction. A Cathari delegate near the back made the particular tonal click that indicated deep institutional displeasure. Kelth, who had been preparing to register mild impatience, found instead that his crest was now at 3/4 height, and that he was, with a clarity that surprised him, paying attention. He had not paid this quality of attention to a council proceeding in a long time. He did not examine why, he simply listened. Okafor began not with the Rethani, but with a question. She addressed it to Scythian directly, which was unusual. Bureau presentations were typically treated as closed, the data offered, not interrogated. Director Scythian, How many species has the Threat Assessment Bureau evaluated for potential threat designation in the Council's history? Scythian, from her seat rather than the platform, answered without particular concern. It was a data question, and data questions were her domain. 847. And how many received preemptive neutralization recommendations that were carried out? A small pause. 43. And of the 804 species assessed but not neutralized, those whose development was permitted to continue, how many ultimately achieved the threat behaviors the model predicted? Kelth watched Scythian's face. He was not certain what he expected to see there. What he saw was a Cathari scientist encountering a question she had not been asked before, which was unusual for someone who had been department head for 40 years. Her expression did not change, but there was a moment, brief, fractional, where her eyes moved in the way that eyes move when a mind is accessing not a prepared answer, but an actual calculation. 11, she said. Okafor said nothing for a moment. She let the number sit in the chamber air. Kelth did the arithmetic without meaning to. His crest held steady at 3/4, and he did the arithmetic, and when he arrived at the result, he sat with it in a way he had not sat with arithmetic during a council vote in his entire career. 847 flagged, 804 unpruned, 11 actual threats. The model's predictive accuracy for genuine threat development was approximately 1.3%. He had voted 12 times based on that number. Okafor let the silence run for exactly as long as it needed to run. Then she continued. She walked the chamber through the model's methodology with the precision of someone who had read every page of it. The 12 variables. The historical weighting. The way the model calibrated aggressive territorial posture and high resource consumption and accelerated military development against data points drawn from species that had actually presented threat behavior. The inputs, the outputs. Then she displayed a chart. It was a retroactive application of the Threat Assessment Bureau's 12 variables to every current council member species at their pre-spaceflight developmental stage. Kelth's display rendered it in crisp detail. Each species was a data point. Each data point was color-coded by whether the model would have recommended preemptive neutralization. The chamber went very quiet. The Growlax data point was deep red, high aggression indicators, militarized development pattern, territorial expansion score in the upper quartile. The Growlax would have been pruned. The Cathari, red, resource consumption projections outside acceptable parameters. The Cathari would have been pruned. Thesari, red, centralized governmental structures that the model associated with expansionist behavior. Thesari would have been pruned. And there, among 267 red data points out of 300 current council species, the Velanori. Kelth looked at his own species marker. He read the numbers without difficulty because he had seen their equivalent on 12 assessments and recognized the format immediately. Territorial expansion score, 71%. Aggression indicators, moderate. Technological trajectory, steep upward curve. The model's recommendation, had it been run on Velanori pre-spaceflight civilization, neutralization. His fingers had gone completely still. Not the frozen mid-sequence stillness of surprise. Something slower, something that was closer to the way a being goes still when they are genuinely, fundamentally rearranging something they believed was fixed. Okafor's voice was level. It carried no particular emphasis on what she said next. That was, Kelth would later reflect, what made it so difficult to deflect. Councilor Kelth, your species was flagged for preemptive neutralization 800 years ago. The Bureau's predecessor institution recommended containment. A single dissenting analyst submitted a revised assessment arguing that the primary territorial expansion indicators were attributable to resource scarcity, not inherent aggression, and that the aggression projections would moderate as Velanori technology improved food production capability. She paused. The revised assessment was accepted. The neutralization recommendation was withdrawn. Your civilization was spared by one analyst's doubt. She did not add, and you have voted for 12 neutralization recommendations in your career. She didn't need to. The moisture film appeared in Kelth's eyes. He had not experienced it in 50 years. The Velanori called it the shimmer. The thin veil of fluid that the lacrimal system produced, not in grief, as humans sometimes assumed when they noticed it. But in the specific moment when something that had been kept at a comfortable emotional distance suddenly arrived, he had shimmered at his clutchmate's passage ceremonies. He had shimmered once long ago when the Velanori homeworld's second moon was eclipsed by the new station ring and the sky looked different in a way it had never looked before, and never would again. He had not shimmered in a council chamber. Not once, not in 120 years. He did not hide it. There was no mechanism available to him that would have helped. Thresh was speaking now. He was good at this. The security block always had the clearest articulation of its position because its position was genuinely internally consistent. The model's low accuracy, he argued, was a feature of conservative risk management, not a flaw. The consequences of missing a genuine threat were existential. The consequences of suppressing a non-threatening civilization were, while regrettable, recoverable. You could not recover from a galactic war. You could not unfight a conflict that consumes star systems. The math of acceptable error was not difficult. 99 false positives to prevent one civilization-ending conflict was a reasonable trade. Several delegates signaled agreement. The security block's inner ring closed ranks. Cal found himself looking at the Growlac's data point on the chart, still visible on his display. The Growlac, who would have been prune, who had not been pruned as it happened, because the containment fleet had been deployed elsewhere that decade and the assessment had been deprioritized. Not because of a philosophical decision, not because of an analyst's doubt, because of logistics. And Thresh, whose species would have been pruned by the same model, was arguing that the model's error rate was acceptable. Kel's fingers began to move, not the standard pre-vote rhythm, an irregular pattern, slow, deliberate, the movement his staff had learned to recognize after a decade of service, the one they called internally the considering motion. He had not made that motion during a vote in years. He made it now. Okafor addressed Thresh's argument without raising her voice. Councilor Thresh describes the choice as preventing one civilization-ending conflict at the cost of 99 suppressed civilizations. That framing accepts the model's accuracy at face value. The model is wrong 98.7% of the time. We are not suppressing 99 civilizations to save one. We are suppressing approximately 847 civilizations for every 11 genuine threats the model might have identified. And we have no way of knowing whether those 11 threats would have materialized because we have no control group. She let that sit. We have been doing this for 3,000 years. We have 43 data points on suppressed civilizations and 0 data points on what they might have become. The model cannot be validated because we keep destroying its subjects. A smaller quiet followed that one, a different quality of quiet. Not the shock of the veto, not the attentive silence of a chamber following an argument, but the specific silence of people who have been given a thought they did not have before and are not certain yet what to do with it. Then Okafor did something no one had done in a pruning proceeding in the model's entire history. She put up an image that was not from the threat assessment data. It appeared on the chamber's main display without preamble, a photograph, slightly blurred by the transmission distance from Theta 7 survey drones, of a carved stone sculpture. 2 figures, unmistakably reptilian, clearly Rethani, carved from the same dark stone in attitudes of close embrace. One figure's body curved over the other in a posture that required no translation matrix to understand. Shelter. The oldest available Rethani artifact, Okafor noted, approximately 3,000 years old. The first known Rethani object that was not a tool. This is what the Bureau's model designates threat level moderate projected, she said. This is what the containment fleet's mandate describes as infrastructure to be suppressed. She advanced through more images. Rethani musical notation. Complex structured evidence of a harmonic theory that the Bureau's cultural survey flagged. In a note buried on page 47 of a file that had never been read in full by any voting member as unexpectedly sophisticated relative to developmental stage. Rethani architecture, the clean mathematical proportions of which had prompted a separate note on page 52, Rethani children's stories. She displayed brief summaries, translated narratives about sacrifice, kindness, and the habit of looking at the stars. She said, the Rethani have a 67% projected aggression score at the 400-year development threshold. Their oldest art is 2 people protecting each other from a storm. She closed the images. I don't know what the Rethani will become. No one in this chamber knows. The Bureau's model doesn't know. It's wrong 98.7% of the time, and it is incapable of knowing. But I know what they are today. They are a civilization 3 billion strong that makes art about sheltering each other, that developed music of sufficient complexity to surprise our own analysts, that tells its children stories about the virtue of sacrifice, and this chamber is being asked to end that. Not because the Rethani have done anything, because they might. She paused. Every species in this room was pre-spaceflight once. Every civilization in this chamber looked from the outside like a potential threat before it was understood. The Growlaks survived because their assessment was deemed logistically complex. The Thesari survived because the containment fleet had a scheduling conflict. The Velanori survived because one analyst had a doubt. The Rethani have no analyst. They have no lucky timing. They don't know this council exists. They don't know they've been sentenced. They are 3 billion people who look at their stars and wonder, and we are about to make sure they never learn the answer. Kelth's shimmer had deepened. He was not attempting to conceal it. He was looking at the after image of the sculpture. The display had moved on, but the shape of it had stayed, the curve of one figure over another. And he was thinking about a word he had used, in his own mind, 12 times: routine. He had cast 12 votes he characterized to himself as routine. The override vote was called. 3/4 majority to override the human veto, 225 of 300 required. Fresh gave a final argument. It was good. Kelth admitted that. It was precise. It was internally consistent. It addressed the actual risk calculus without sentimentality. Security was not cruelty. It was the recognition that the galaxy's current peace had been built on decisions that were sometimes uncomfortable, and that comfort was not the relevant metric. He was not wrong that existential threats were existential. He was not wrong that the cost of one missed threat was incalculable. But the Sari delegation had gone into quiet conference, and 3 minor species, Kelth could see them on his peripheral display, were changing their voting intentions. Species from the retroactive flagging chart who had not, until this hour, understood what they were looking at. Then the Thesari representative stood. She was old, older than Kelth, and she spoke without any of the characteristic Thesari obliqueness. She said that she had reviewed her species entry on the chart. She said that at the equivalent developmental stage, the Sari would have received a neutralization recommendation with 71% projected threat probability, 4 points higher than the Rethani's current score. She said that she could not in good conscience vote to sustain a system that, had it existed then, would have ended every being in this chamber who shared her ancestry. She changed her vote. The count fell short, 219 in favor of the override, 81 against, the required 225 not achieved. The veto held. Resolution 1187 was dead. The Rethani would not be pruned. The chamber broke into noise immediately. Celebration from the outer ring species and the delegations who had shifted. Anger from the security block. The particular tonal signature of 200 beings talking past each other in 6 languages. Kelth sat in it. His crest had dropped, not to half-mast, not to the comfortable default of his career. It had dropped to a position he had not occupied in 50 years, pressed flat against his neck in the posture his species expressed as shame. He stayed in his seat after the chamber emptied. His display was still open. The session packet still showed item 7 in the completed queue, and on impulse. He could not say why, only that the shimmer in his eyes had not cleared and something had shifted in the architecture of how he thought about his morning. He opened the full assessments, not the summary, the full files, for all 12. He started with the first one, which had been voted on in his 53rd year on the Council, a civilization called in the Bureau's designation Subject 7 Omicron 3. He had not known their name at the time. He had voted yes in 11 minutes based on a 2-page summary. The full file was 847 pages. He read the cultural survey, which began on page 412. The species had developed a mathematical proof for prime number distribution before achieving combustion-based propulsion. They had produced poetry in 512 recognized forms. Their architectural philosophy organized civic space around the principle that every building should be visible from at least two others so that no structure stood alone. The Bureau's cultural complexity rating, 7.4 out of 10. Sufficient for documentation purposes, not sufficient to effect a recommendation. He read the next file. And the next. The stars outside the chamber's observation strip moved through their positions while he read. His junior colleague Aethris returned at one point to ask if he was staying for the evening session, and Kelth, without looking up, said he would not be attending. Aethris left with the expression of someone who understood that something had changed and would not ask about it until they were invited to. Kelth found the cultural surveys for all 12. All 12 had them. The Bureau conducted them as a matter of procedure, and they were thorough. Art, music, literature, architectural philosophy, narrative traditions. 12 civilizations, each with its own version of looking at the stars and reaching toward them. He looked up each species' current status in the monitoring archives. 3 had recovered to pre-industrial levels and were advancing again, slowly, their development curves bent by the suppression but not broken. He sat with that for a moment. 3 species who had woken up one day to find their technology gone, who had spent generations rebuilding, who were still climbing. 5 remained in active suppression. Their monitoring arrays reported pre-industrial stabilization. The Bureau's reassessment dates were centuries away. 4 had declined. He read the decline reports carefully. The mechanisms were not dramatic, no single catastrophic event. The removal of industrial infrastructure had not simply reset these civilizations to an earlier state. It had severed the connections that held the state together. Medical technology gone, life expectancy dropped, agricultural infrastructure disrupted, food systems collapsed. Educational institutions reliant on suppressed technology fell silent. The social fabric that had grown around a certain level of capability had not known how to reweave itself at a lower level. Populations fell. Cultures fragmented. 3 of the 4 had achieved what the Bureau's monitoring described as cultural continuity below meaningful threshold, a phrase that took Kelth a moment to parse, and when he parsed it, kept him very still for a long time. The 4th was listed as presumptive extinction event, monitoring array decommissioned. He found the cultural survey for the 4th species, the extinct one. He read it from the first page. They had made sculpture. The style was different. These beings had not been reptilian, they had been hexapodal, and their carving technique reflected a different relationship with material and grip and the angle at which force met stone. But the subject, on the survey's 3rd documented artifact, was 2 figures close together, one curved over the other. He sat for a very long time. His crest remained flat against his neck. The shimmer in his eyes had not cleared. It would not clear that night, and when he returned to his chambers and his staff asked how the session had been, he would find that he could not answer in the ways he had previously used to answer that question, because those ways had all presumed that the session was something that happened to him, rather than something he had been participating in for 120 years. He slept badly. He woke before the 6th hour. He did not review the session packet. He sent a message requesting a meeting with Ambassador Lena Okafor. She met him in the diplomatic quarters secondary conference alcove at the 8th hour. She was, as he had expected, already working. Her display showed incoming messages, and she navigated them with the focus of someone managing a political situation rather than celebrating a victory. The fallout from the veto was significant. Several delegations had lodged formal protests. The security bloc was coordinating a response. Humanity's diplomatic position, which had been neutral positive in most of the Council's key relationships, was in a complicated phase. She looked up when he entered. Her expression suggested she had prepared herself for the meeting to be a complaint. He said, "I am introducing a motion to review every pruning resolution in Council history. I want an independent audit of the Threat Assessment Bureau's predictive model, retroactive cultural preservation assessments for all previously affected species, and a moratorium on future applications of the neutralization protocol pending review." Okafor was quiet for a moment, not the silence of surprise, something more considered. "That will end your career, yes." He had been over this in the small hours quite thoroughly. "The security faction will remove me from every committee. The Velanori delegation will issue a statement of disassociation. I'll serve out my remaining tenure in the equivalent of the back bench. He thought of Kesserai, whom he had spent 50 years privately considering impractical. I understand this. Why? Kelth was quiet for a moment. He had rehearsed, in the small hours, a careful answer to this. Something measured, something that could function as a political statement, the kind of answer that sounded like principle without creating additional targets. He had prepared this answer and found in the moment of being asked that he could not use it. He said, I voted 12 times. 12 species. I never read the full files. I never looked at what I was voting for. Not once, not in 120 years. I processed it as a minor agenda item and moved to item 8. His crest was still flat. You showed us a sculpture, 2 figures sheltering each other from a storm. The Rethani made that 3,000 years ago, and we were prepared to end the civilization that made it because a model that is wrong 98.7% of the time produced a number. His fingers moved, a single beat on the armrest, not the pre-vote drumming, just one beat as if marking something. I cannot uncast those 12 votes. 4 of those species are gone. I have read their cultural surveys, and I know what we destroyed, and I cannot uncast those votes, but I can make sure there isn't a 13th. Okafor looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression that Kelth did not have an immediate category for, not sympathy exactly, not approval, not the satisfaction of a one argument, something closer to the look of someone who has been doing a difficult thing alone and has just discovered they are not entirely alone. She extended her hand, the human gesture, the one Kelth had always found anatomically interesting, the open palm, the grip, the sustained physical contact that humans offered as a token of alliance. He reached out with his own hand, 6 fingers meeting her 5, careful as he always was with human handshakes, because the finger ratio created logistical considerations. She said, the Rethani will never know what almost happened to them. He considered this for a moment. He thought of the 3 billion people on Theta 7 who had no idea a chamber full of species they'd never imagined had just finished deciding their future, who were, at this moment, doing whatever it was that 3 billion Rethani did on an ordinary day. Working, building, sleeping, telling their children stories about the virtue of sacrifice and the habit of looking at stars. He said no, but they'll be alive to not know it. That's sufficient. He walked out of the diplomatic quarter into the corridors of the council complex, which looked, as they always looked, exactly as they had on the first day he had walked them. The same geometric floors, the same ambient lighting calibrated for the comfort of species across 100 different visual spectra, the same murmur of 300 civilizations doing the continuous work of coexisting. His personal display, in his inner pocket, held an image. He had saved it from the session file before closing everything down the night before, the photograph from Theta 7's survey drone, slightly blurred by transmission distance, of a carved stone sculpture. 2 figures, one curved over the other in shelter. He set it as his display background. He looked at it every day for the rest of his career, through the motions introduction, which was covered extensively and controversially by every major council news media, through the security bloc's campaign against his committee positions, which was successful, through the Velanori delegation's formal statement, which was precisely as damaging as he had anticipated, through the audit's early findings, which were worse than even Okafor had implied, through the long, difficult years of a political position that offered no comfortable middle ground, no safe abstention, no item 8 to move to. He looked at it on the days when he was tired and the back bench felt very far from where he had sat for 120 years. He looked at it when the independent audit released its preliminary findings and the chamber reacted with the particular institutional fury of a body confronting something it had known and not known simultaneously. He looked at it when 3 of the suppressed species monitoring arrays were decommissioned, not because the civilizations had recovered, but because the civilizations had declined to the point where there was nothing left to monitor. He looked at it when the Bureau's model was, after 4 years of proceedings, formally suspended pending revision, and the chamber voted, not unanimously, not without cost, but by a genuine majority, to establish the first cultural preservation review, He never went back to comfortable half-mast. Some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. He had spent 120 years not seeing them, and he had 12 votes on his record that would not be revised, and he could not undo them. But he had learned, late and at significant cost, the difference between processing a vote and understanding one, between marking yes and knowing what yes means on the ground, in the fires, in the civilization that wakes up one day to find its achievements gone. The crest position he occupied in his final years had no standard Villanori name. It was somewhere between shame and determination, a posture that meant, I know what I did, and I am trying now to do differently. Some things shouldn't be unseen. Some things should be seen the first time, before the votes are cast and the files are closed and the containment fleet is already deployed. Some things should be looked at directly, with all the discomfort that looking requires, before the agenda moves on to item 8. The Rethani do not know this. They are looking at their stars tonight, 3 billion of them, and wondering they will build their way up to those stars, at whatever pace their civilization chooses, and they will eventually find the signals that indicate someone else is out there, and they will have all the complicated feelings that entails. They will never know how close it came. They will never know about the chamber and the vote and the human woman who stood at her seat in the outer ring and said 3 words that stopped everything. They will never know about the old avian councilor who sat in an empty chamber reading files he should have read decades ago, with moisture filming his golden eyes, finally understanding what his 12 votes had meant. They will never know about the sculpture, their oldest art, their 2 figures sheltering each other from a storm, displayed in a chamber they don't know exists, used as an argument for their right to continue. But they will be alive. They will look at their stars and reach toward them and build their civilization upward, and somewhere in that future they will make more art, more music, more stories about what it means to shelter each other. And they will never know, because they don't need to know, that the argument for their survival was the art they had already made. It was enough. It was, Draeven Kelth came to believe in the years he had left, entirely sufficient.